As I've already pointed out, one of the areas where libertarians are the most wrong is with regards to the issue of campaign finance. It should be no surprise to anybody that when you have people like the Koch brothers, who are big financiers of such organizations as the Institute for Humane Studies, the logical result would be that they put out a horrible propaganda video such as this about how great it is that billionaires control the political process. The most egregious example of propaganda is this, as if the Citizens United decision has actually led to a multi-party system. But of course the facts speak otherwise. In fact, allow me to give a more personal example. Congressman Bill Cassidy is my representative. He represents Louisiana's 6th Congressional District. And in the 2012 election, he ran against two other contenders, a Libertarian candidate named Rufus Holt Craig Jr. and an independent candidate, Richard Torregano. During the course of the election, Cassidy raised a total of $1,797,931, mostly from various medical associations such as the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons and the American Association of Neurological Surgeons, just to name a few, along with a few business groups such as Koch Industries. The Cassidy campaign, reinforced by special interest money, outspent the other two candidates, who, by the way, had absolutely no special interest money behind them, to the tune of approximately $653,528, which subsequently resulted in Mr. Cassidy's victory with 79% of the vote on the first round. A freaking landslide. So here you have a perfect example of how massive special interest money can make elections totally non-competitive. And so long as we continue to operate our elections on the basis of who can be auctioned off at the highest bidder at the highest price, we'll continue to have candidates who are simply clones of the previous ones, working in the exclusive interest of those who possess large amounts of money to fund their campaigns, which can be either individual billionaires or basically any sort of special interest organization with an axe to grind, and completely marginalizing the individual voter's voice and interests. So the point that I want to make in this video is that there's a pressing need for electoral reform in Louisiana in three ways. 1. Institute a partial public financing system for political parties by the state government. 2. Change the voting system for the State House of Representatives to achieve more proportional results. And 3. Take the power of redistricting out of legislative control and turn it over to a citizens' commission like in California. Right, so for those of you who've watched my previous video on Buddy Roemer, I'm basically going to reiterate my call for instituting a per-vote subsidy. It's important for any country, such as the United States of all places, that claims to have any kind of democratic representative government, must be that in its truest sense. And what I mean by that is simply this. We should be a democracy in that the government should be founded on the will of the people pursuant to Article 1, Section 1 of our state constitution, and that we should be a republic, and that the government should represent actual people through free and fair elections. But right now, our government is neither a democracy nor a republic. The government doesn't represent the people or the states. It simply functions as an enforcement arm of corporate America. But there's a way that we can change that, or at the very least make it not as bad as it currently is. And I think in order to secure a truly democratic and representative system, the funding for political parties and campaigns should come exclusively from the people through their government. And of course what's needed is a complete abolition of political action committees, but as things currently stand, that's pretty far off. If it ever happens at all. However, in the meantime, we can at least dampen the effects of special interests by instituting what's called a per-vote subsidy like they have in Canada. And I think the Canadians have come up with a pretty good system that would be very applicable to our own. Now, what the per vote subsidy means is that political parties would receive funding from the state government per year proportional to the number of votes they get. I think each party that receives at least 5% of the total statewide vote in Louisiana should receive $5 for every vote. For instance, let's say that a party gets 100,000 votes in an election and it meets the 5% threshold. Therefore, the party would be paid $500,000 per year out of the state treasury until the next general election, which would then determine how much they receive, proportional to how well they did in that election. So this is a pretty fair public subsidy. It's not meant to replace private donations or PACs, but it would at least dampen the effects of shady money. It's also fair to smaller parties and would better enable them to grow and compete in elections, even if they don't win. I think the subsidy should be set for every state general election every 4 years, with an additional $2.50 per vote bonus for each national general election and midterm election. To my horror, I found that in our state general election back in 2011, a total of 62 legislative incumbents had won re-election totally unopposed. For the Senate, 20 senators out of 39 returned without any competition, which means that 51% of the chamber remained unchanged. And in the House, 42 representatives out of 105 were re-elected unopposed. Now, ideally, with the implementation of the per vote subsidy, we could likely see, here and there, more third-party candidates, primarily libertarians, shaking up the system and creating more competition in legislative races. As it currently stands, our 144-member state legislature is based on representatives being elected on the basis of single-member electoral districts, with the 105 House of Representatives representing 105 districts, and the 39 Senate seats representing 39 districts. But I think to further hedge against gerrymandering and completely non-competitive districts, we must also consider holding legislative elections on the basis of multi-member districts, enabling multiple winners through either one of two alternative voting processes as a way of forever preventing such a travesty as what happened in 2011, while at the same time yielding more proportional results. My first proposition is the Single Non-transferable Vote, or SNTV for short. And its advantage is that it maintains simplicity with a degree of proportionality. And it works like this. Representatives are elected in multi-member constituencies, but you can only vote for one candidate. And the total number of candidates with the most votes equal to the total number of seats in the district are elected. For example, in a district that elects 3 representatives, the top 3 candidates who've won the most votes win. Simple. And the rationale behind this voting process is that even though voters are limited to only one candidate in a district that elects multiple representatives, it spreads the votes out as evenly as possible so that as many voters as possible will get the candidate they voted for. And my second alternative is the limited vote, or LV for short, and I can explain that quickly. This system is similar to SNTV in that there are multi-member electoral districts. However, you are allowed to vote for more than one candidate, but less than there are seats. For instance, using the 3-member district example, you can vote for 2 candidates, and the top 3 candidates win. And the advantage of this voting system is that it gives voters more choice, but doesn't enable the majority of voters to outvote and crush a smaller coalition of voters. Hence the rationale behind the limited voting process. And the reason why I suggest these two voting systems is because they're simple and achieve a certain degree of proportionality. Now, of course, there are other voting systems like proportional representation, but those aren't really applicable to our system. And of course, even if we do change over to something like these systems, it doesn't mean that the legislature is going to look like this, where we suddenly have a multi-party system. However, they are more democratic and representative and would create much more competition by giving voters more choice and fairer results. So to put this in practical terms, I'd suggest that if, say, we were to implement SNTV, I think we have three choices in redrawing the electoral map to elect the 105 state representatives. One is by having 35 three-member districts, which isn't all that proportional, but it is more competitive and maintains a close constituency link between the voters and their representatives. Another choice would be to have 15 three-member districts and 10 six-member districts, which would make a total of 25 constituencies. That way the range of small and large districts would make the results more proportional. But the most likely scenario would be to have a number of single-member districts in conjunction with larger multi-member districts over those, so that we wouldn't marginalize, say, more minority-centered areas of the state or over-represent rural, less populated areas. And for the limited vote, I'd suggest 21 five-member districts and giving the voters either 2 or 3 choices per district. That way, or I should say 2 or 3 votes per district. That way you give the majority of voters multiple choices, but there's still enough room left for everybody else. Additionally, I think the Senate should continue to be elected through single-member districts for balance in contrast to the more proportional House. Or perhaps just use SNTV for House elections and LV for the Senate, but I'll leave that to the viewer to decide which is more fair. And lastly, I think we really need to take away the power of redistricting from the legislature and place that authority into the hands of the people through some sort of citizens commission. And that's all I really had to say about that. It's just as an aside. So, in closing, the bottom line is that under these current conditions, we simply cannot trust our government. And when I say that, I don't mean it in the sense that libertarians do, in that the poor people and working class people shouldn't vote in their self-interest. What I mean is that our elected representatives have been totally disconnected from the people they represent by special interest groups. The average voter, the overwhelming majority of voters in fact, don't have millions or billions of dollars to compete with this kind of perverse corporatism where everybody and their grandmother, I mean literally everybody and their grandmother, has a special interest group ranging from gun groups to abortion groups, religious groups, and the list goes on and on. And that's why we're seeing people disengaging from politics en masse, because they feel that voting makes no difference. My God, I'm reminded of a quote from JFK, whoever makes a peaceful revolution impossible makes a violent one inevitable. And when you really let that sink in, that's a pretty scary statement. And therefore, when the government no longer represents the people's interests, it should be no surprise that there's been this proliferation of all kinds of people wanting to overthrow the government. So, in order to preserve some reasonable facsimile of a representative and democratic government, I offer my suggestions for partial public subsidization of political parties, a new voting system for the House, and redistricting through a citizens commission. So, thank you for watching, and I hope that this has edified somebody and hopefully sparks a movement to get this done. Alright, see you soon.